Hi everyone, Joseph Lavoie here. Welcome to Business is Politics. Today I have for you the uncut interview, my conversation with Christine Quigley, my brilliant colleague from Crestview Strategy, who is an expert in all things labor politics in the UK. Obviously, we're talking about the aftermath of last week's election results, but we take a different turn. We're not going to do political analysis. We're going to talk about what this means for businesses. We're going to talk about the need to look at the electoral map and understand the implications that has for the types of things, issues, topics that this government's going to be focused on and what that means for businesses. You don't need to be a business operating in the UK to get value from this conversation. Understanding how governments think, particularly in the early weeks and months of their new mandate, is something that every business needs to be preoccupied with. I hope you enjoy this one. If you do, please don't hesitate to start giving me some 5-star reviews on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Enjoy. I really wanted us to have this conversation a good week after the results because I prefer to let the dust settle and get through the hype of the first couple days to get a clear-eyed view of where things are at. But first, start with an introduction. Tell us who you are, what you do, and why I'm asking you to speak to us about labor politics in the UK.
Sure. Thanks so much, Joseph. I'm really nice to be here. So my name is Christine Quigley. I am a Vice President at Crestview Strategy based in our London office. I tend to work in government relations and public affairs, mostly across transport, energy and technology, but probably of most relevance to this conversation. I used to work for the Labour Party before it was cool, when we were in opposition, so I was a political advisor. I've been a member of the Labour Party for about 20 years now, here in the UK. I've been an activist for years. I've been involved in lots of different kind of groups within the party, and I've even stood for election, but at a London regional level, not at a national level.
I didn't know that. But choosing to become a staffer when you're in opposition, I think, is a sign of how dedicated you are. I only did so once we won a majority government. So there's a clear difference between someone who's willing to put their hat in the ring when you're in opposition versus in government.
I think it was hope rather than an expectation.
All right, well, let's get into it. Let's start with the big picture. Walk us through what this means specifically for businesses in the UK, and then maybe even touch on what it means for globally minded businesses, given London's role in international commerce.
Sure. So the election result hasn't really been a surprise in the sense that the polls over the last year and a half have been pretty consistent that Labour was likely to win a majority. What was a bit of a surprise was the timing. We were all very much working on the basis that we'd see an election maybe in November 2024. So the previous Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, had to call an election by the beginning of January 2025, so we thought he was going to kind of string it out as long as possible. So lots of businesses and charities and campaign groups have been planning on the basis it was probably going to be at the end of this year. However, Labour's been very much ahead in the polls. There's been a huge change within the Labour Party over the last 4 years since Sir Keir Starmer, who's now the Prime Minister, took over the leadership in April 2020. Previously, the party had had an absolutely catastrophic loss in 2019, was seen by a lot of people as unelectable. There were internal problems within the party around discipline. There were issues with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that really had to be tackled. So there's been a huge internal piece of work from Labour in order to get to a position where they were electable, and quite a lot of that has been focusing on building that relationship with business. So the useful thing about Labour being a very democratic party is that its policy position, its platform, is actually pretty open. So we've known for quite a while what the party was running on, and underpinning absolutely everything is an absolute laser focus on economic growth. So we've had a cost of living crisis here in the UK, as people have obviously been experiencing throughout the Western world on the back of the COVID pandemic. And there are some real challenges here in the UK at the moment. We've seen lots of industrial relations activity, we've seen job losses, particularly in parts of the country that are kind of underinvested in. So Labour is incredibly heavily focused on that. In the first couple of days, we've already seen some quite big announcements on planning reform, particularly to get more renewable energy going quickly. We know here in the UK we have to decarbonise our electricity grid. The previous Conservative government wanted to do it by kind of 2035, 2040. Labour is bringing that forward to 2030, and it's really looking at how to kind of liberalise the planning system to get that moving, but also how it can provide that policy certainty so that the private sector is able to invest alongside the public sector in new technologies. So that all feels quite exciting. There's also a lot of focus on housing crisis. Similar to Canada, we have a real housing crisis here. We don't build enough homes. Every government in the last 30 years in the UK has promised to build 300,000 homes a year. We haven't actually done that since 1948, and the way we did it in 1948 was we nationalised all of the bricks. That's not what they're planning on doing this time round. But there's a real focus on getting housing delivery moving as quickly as possible. When I'm kind of going out and talking to businesses, I think they're feeling relatively positive about this focus on growth, this focus on infrastructure in particular, and some of the sectors that are actually critical to delivering infrastructure, so advanced manufacturing, steel, for example, which all feels very positive. Just in terms of kind of UK-Canada relations, I felt really cheered that the first meeting that our new Foreign Secretary had was with his Canadian counterpart. So we already have a free trade agreement, which is great. I think we're going to be seeing quite a lot more of that. And there is a real understanding, in particular here in the UK, that in our infrastructure sector, a lot of the big investors are Canadian pension funds who are going to be really critical to this transition to net zero energy and other kind of decarbonisation in other sectors too.
The speed with which this government's moving, though, like I've been marveling at it, and I think it's one of those things that often businesses assume is that government is a slow actor, a slow mover, and particularly I think it can often feel that way when you're in the final days of a dying government. When it seems like everything's come to a standstill, but the pace with which these guys are moving in the first week, I really can't wrap my head around this. Maybe it's because I'm so stateside. I'm used to the long transition period in the US. We have a transition period here in Canada. You have a little bit of time to get your bearings and figure out how you're going to engage with this government. But this seems to be like they're full tilt, full scale right away. I'm wondering what impact that has, you think, for how businesses conduct themselves with this government, at least in the early days.
Yeah, I mean, the transition period in the UK is always really short. So usually we have an election. We always have an election on a Thursday. We know the results by pretty early on Friday morning. The Prime Minister goes to see the King at some point on Friday. Then the new Prime Minister comes in immediately. So we knew that was going to happen. What we weren't expecting was how quickly some major policy decisions were going to be announced. But this is a government in a real hurry. It's a government that's won a really substantial majority, but on the basis of enormous swings in constituencies across the country. And I think they're very aware that those things could swing back enormously next time round. While Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who's our Chancellor, our Finance Minister, are talking about a 10-year mission for national renewal, and they're looking at this as a two-term thing. They're quite aware that they may only have 5 years to get done what they want to get done, so they're moving really quickly. The first thing that I think businesses will be watching out for will be the King's speech, which is due to be on the 17th of July. So that's when the King will actually set out the kind of main legislative programme for this parliamentary session. We'll get a sense of what exactly they want to focus on. We know that there will be something broad called the Take Back Control Bill, which will look at regulation across lots of different sectors, trying to find some of those benefits of Brexit, if there are any. We know that there will be the establishment of GB Energy, which is this new company which is supposed to help with the transition of our energy sector and work with the private sector in order to deliver that. We are expecting there to be some kind of quite retail-focused policies. So, for example, Labour's been talking a lot about changing football governance here in the UK. So actually looking at the whole structure of soccer. Keir Starmer himself is an absolute passionate Arsenal fan, so we're going to be expecting some of that stuff as well.
Shame. That'd be perfect.
I know. He's got a season ticket and everything. He's genuinely committed to it. So I think we're going to see what this government is going to prioritise in the next few weeks from that 17th of July King's speech. And then the next really big date in the diary will be the political party conferences. So here at the end of September, early October, each of the parties get together and have a bit of a jamboree of members and activists and politicians, and the business community tend to go as well. And we'll have some really interesting conversations there about what Labour wants to do, not just in its first 100 days, which feels really clear, but in its first year and in its first 5 years too.
You touched on this. I often talk about the need to look at the electoral map. If you're in business, you should understand, constituency maps the same way politicians do. And a lot of this win, I think the narrative around in the week after the vote has been clear. This is not necessarily like a Tony Blair-like win, right? There was a massive shift in popular vote in 97. This time around, obviously a huge shift in seats, but a lot of that came, from my understanding of it, and you'll correct me where I'm wrong, less so as a result of the share of the popular vote or gains by Labour, but much so a split of the vote among other parties. And so your point on the self-awareness that this government has around maybe it's a 5-year window to get what it needs to get done. I'm just wondering if that can drive additional thinking on their part. How do you think that they can get to a place where they can build confidence among stakeholders and among businesses that there might be more than a 5-year window here?
Yeah, I mean, I would just slightly dispute, and I completely get your point around sort of Starmer versus Blair, and this has been a real narrative that this hasn't been the same kind of win that Blair had. It's worth bearing in mind that in terms of the swing that Keir Starmer needed to achieve to get any majority at all, he had to deliver a bigger swing than Tony Blair did in 1997, and he did that and then some. So what we've seen is we've got, a first past the post system here in the UK. Labour has about 2/3 of the seats in Parliament, and it got that on about 1/3 of the vote share. Now, it did that because, actually fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2019, but Labour traditionally has been incredibly strong in a number of our cities, actually most big UK cities, but what happens is that it tends to absolutely stack up those votes. So I live in East London, in Walthamstow. My MP used to have a majority of 35,000. She now doesn't, she has a majority of kind of 20-odd thousand, but Labour doesn't need to be stacking up votes in those constituencies. What it has done, because it's always had these strengths in cities, it's won a lot of towns and it's won some really quite rural communities as well. I think that's going to be a real challenge for Labour because it's really good on kind of city issues, but actually having to deal with rural issues around farming and agriculture. The agri-food sector here in the UK is obviously incredibly important. Looking at kind of economic development in towns, looking at tourism, rural broadband, for example, is a big issue in lots of parts of the country. So that electoral map is going to change some of the priorities, which I think is going to be really interesting. But we did see a lot of tactical voting. So in lots of parts of the UK, people just wanted to get rid of the Tories. So they might have voted Labour or they might have voted Liberal Democrats, but Labour has really picked up a lot of seats from people who maybe don't normally vote for them. So I think Starmer and his team have now got 5 years to kind of show people that they were right, and the biggest way they're going to do that is by getting the economy back on track. So I think that's why we're getting this really laser-like focus. Everything has got to be about growth and jobs.
I think the mistake a lot of people could make would be to assume that this Labour government is like a previous Labour government. But what you described about the requirement now to govern for so many of these rural constituencies, I do think has implications for the types of stakeholders they're going to have to engage with, the types of issues that they need to focus on. And so it's very handy, I think, when a new government wins to look at where they got those gains and how that's going to impact the way they govern. But I didn't know that. That was very helpful. Thank you. So let's talk about that on this theme then. If I want to speak Labour's language in 2024, 2025, what changes would I need to make if I become so used to engaging with the previous government, I've become so used to dealing with the Tories? What are some, highline top 1, 2, 3 things I'd have to really wrap my head around to speak their language and be effective?
Sure. So we've seen a really interesting language change in the first couple of days, actually. So the previous government, the Conservative government, had this policy of levelling up the country. So effectively, we're very aware that productivity, economic growth is very concentrated in London, and we need to actually deliver that in other parts of the country. There are real issues there. So the previous government talked about levelling up the country so that other people were performing in the same, or other parts of the country were performing in the same way as London was. Labour doesn't use that language, and not only does it not use that language, it's actually changed the name of of the relevant government department. So we had had a ministry for communities and local government, or housing communities and local government, for years and years. The Tories came in and called it the Department for Levelling Up. Didn't really catch on. And they've changed it back. They said, levelling up was a buzzword, it was a bit of PR, it didn't really mean anything in terms of policy. They go back to calling it the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So they are already looking at language quite carefully. And I think, as you say, like tuning into the kind of language that parties are using is really, really crucial. But more broadly, what I would say to businesses that are trying to engage with this new government is to really look at what Labour's 5 missions are and the way they talk about it, and to reflect those back. So because they know that they don't necessarily have a lot of time, they have a lot of things that they want to get done. I think if you are framing what you want to achieve and what your ask is in the context of those 5 missions, I think it's going to be much, much easier to get a hearing. And that language is all kind of publicly available. You're seeing it in speeches all of the time. And the kind of last thing I think is maybe a bit harder for businesses to tap into, but a lot of the language that Starmer and his team have been using is very much about aspiration. So in the context of the cost of living crisis, we've seen, a situation where here in the UK, we've got more food banks than we do pubs at the moment.
Are you serious?
Absolutely.
You have a lot of pubs.
You have a lot of pubs. But, a lot of people in this country are really, really struggling. Real wages for many people are lower than they were in 2008. Starmer, in particular, in his party conference speech last year, talked about thriving rather than surviving. He talked about coming from a very normal working class family, as he did. His parents were able to take their kids on holiday once a year. That's just a normal expectation. And that's something that we're starting to see, really tapped into, this idea that people should be, they should want a, better life for their kids. They should want safer streets. They should want an NHS or National Health Service that they don't have to wait for months in a queue in order to access. And so a lot of that language about aspiration is really coming through. And I think it's something that businesses should be reflecting back.
That's great. Let's close it out. Then you talked about some of the lens that the PM is bringing to this. I find often when look at particularly the media coverage after an election, you start to see the same narratives, the same talking points over and over again. One thing I'm not seeing is, and so I'm really curious to get your take on this, is what's the one thing business leaders are likely to get wrong about this prime minister or this government?
I think you actually touched on it earlier. It's assuming that this government is going to be the same as the Tony Blair government in 1997. And it's been really weird. In the last couple of days, we've seen Tony Blair on the airwaves. He's been quoted in the papers. He's got a big conference on today. And there's almost this sense that Tony Blair is directing things behind the scenes, or is advising Keir Starmer. It's more than 25 years since his government was first elected, and this one is quite different. The way they think is different, the personalities and the people are quite different. It's really important to kind of understand where the Labour Party is now, and not just assume that it's going to do things that Blair did in 97, because actually the policy platforms are quite different.
Got it. Awesome. Thanks, Christine.
Nice to be on.